All right. Well, hopefully that got everybody a little pumped up in their seats and excited.
Yeah, it's always good to lead with LeBron.
Makes us look really good, right?
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much for having us here today. Intel's connection and involvement in Israel is very significant. I've been told we're, if not the largest employer, one of the largest employers in the country. And with our recent acquisition of Mobileye, that's only expanded that footprint. And I specifically work with Intel Sports and run the New York office here. And Intel Sports was actually created as a result of an acquisition of an Israeli company, Replay Technologies, which actually is responsible for the technology you saw in that video. The other key anchor for us is a company that we now call True VR, and focused in on, no surprise, VR. The exciting thing about Intel in sports is that our CEO spent about a third of his keynote address at CES this past January talking about immersive video, and immersive really being this new era of technology and the viewing experience, as was pointed out before we came on stage. And when we looked at the right partners and where to go in terms of building out Intel Sports, it was a no-brainer in terms of the right partners to align with. And I'm actually personally excited to hear what Steve has to say today, because the NBA is really recognized as the premier professional sports league out there from a technological standpoint. All the things that Commissioner Emeritus Stern did and Commissioner Silver have built on are just really having a significant impact around the world, not just in the United States, but globally. So kind of with that, I just love to kind of flip it over to my good friend Steve here.
Sure, Sean. Thanks very much. So Replay Technologies is an example of volumetric VR. So there's actually 26 4K cameras around the rim of the Quicken Loans Arena, and then they're processing the video afterward. So it takes a little time, and that's one of the things we're working with Intel, is to speed that up. Because imagine if an announcer could actually speak to that replay and control the movement, right? And explain what was happening in a play. That would make it much better for the NBA, because we'd have more fans around the world, because people could understand the game, right? So that's something that we're greatly looking forward to. So that's an example of Intel's push into volumetric VR, which is really where I think it's going to kind of end up, right? There's other, I call that outside-in VR. The other VR is inside-out, right? Is a VR capture mechanism with an array of cameras, right? So you're fixed to that location, and it happens that the NBA, that works pretty well for the NBA. It works really well for boxing. Works well for some sports, not for all sports, because you are fixed, and otherwise they need you to move you to other locations. But we're very interested in the NBA about this, because, as Sean knows, one of Adam Silver's missions is to bring fans to courtside, because so many of our fans around the world will never get to the United States and never get to courtside. So we're always trying to have that experience, to give people the experience of sitting at courtside, where they really see the speed and grace and athleticism and the strength of the players, and the physicality of the game as well. You can see all that when you sit in a seat at courtside. It's a little harder to see it otherwise. So we fight the same thing, in a lot of senses, that hockey fights. Hockey fights is more difficult. Well, not a fight, but when you move a camera, right? When you move a camera, you knock the speed out of a player, right? So when you watch LeBron accelerate by somebody, you kind of go, wow, he just went past him. Well, if you're in the court at courtside, you go, oh my God, he just bursted his speed enormously and flew by that guy. So we're always trying to somehow communicate that, as best we can. So I started a lot of this stuff with in 2008 with actually I was doing 3D, right? And the little burst that was 3D around 2008, 2007, 2008, 2009. And I was actually working with Vince Pace, who formed a company with James Cameron called Pace Cameron. I think James gave him the lead in it. But It was, and we were interested in it for the same reason, you know, bring fans to courtside. So when VR, when 3D got to television, it just fell apart. There simply wasn't enough bits in your head to actually create that 3D image, because let's face it, the 3D is made in the back of your head, not with your eyes. So, and I never forget, I called James Cameron up, you know, and I said, "Hey, James, this isn't working." And he goes, "Well, what is it going to take to make it work?" I said, "Well, the people at home would have to have like an 80-inch screen. It would have to be uncompressed HD into both eyes, and they'd have to have a chair where they could sit about 5 feet from the monitor." He said, "Great, let's do it." Of course, I couldn't find any distributor that wanted to do that. So I think I think there's great promise in Intel's, you know, approach, and particularly in the ecosystem that Intel's creating. In fact, they have a studio, right? Your studio out in LA?
Yes, that's a great great segue. See, we just opened, and it's actually not really open for business fully yet, but we have a studio that's about 10,000 square feet of actual video capture space. It's a giant geodesic dome, which when it's fully operational will have about 100 cameras, 100 5K cameras situated around. And literally within that space, there's like 5 miles of fiber that, you know, linked to our, you know, I think 40 racks of servers. So it's a pretty incredible space. And it's the largest and only one of its kind in the world. And coincidentally, it's actually on Jim Cameron's set on his backlot.
Oh, wow.
So it's all roads seem to lead back there.
Great. So the most successful movie ever created in 3D obviously was Avatar, right? So if you watch that film, it really has the hint to what will make VR ultimately successful, right? And why why we still need work, why we're still at the beginning of what will be a long run, I think, for VR. In the sense that what James did was in every single scene, if you break it down, he has blurred everything around what he wants you to turn into 3D, right? What he wants your brain to focus at. So in fact, your brain is not VR, your brain is AR, right? So in other words, if you look at me, right, you defocus everything else, right? That's just me, right? So that's what's called, so there's 3 principles of optics that I actually just got a chance to review because I was reading Walter Isaacson's book on Leonardo da Vinci. Right, so Leonardo, in his notebooks, talks about 3 things. He talks about perspective, right? That things are distant from each other, right? That things recede into space, right? He talks about color, that your color perception changes as an object gets further away from you, right? So, and the third thing he talks about, most importantly, is acuity, right? So he talks about that anything in the foreground, when you establish a foreground object, it needs to be painted very determinedly and very, very carefully and very clearly. So you can see that if you look at his paintings, he's always giving you an entry point, which is a hand, right, which is a face, which is something. And from there, he establishes depth, right? So in VR, we really need the same sort of thing to proceed. So in other words, I need to know what you're looking at, you know, so that we can provide the bits so you can get the acuity. Because right now in VR, when you go to look at something, it doesn't come to you as a clear image, right? The way your vision works normally. So I think that's certainly something that Intel is working on. So in other words, the device needs to know what you're looking at, or we're also working with Intel on something else, which is to take my player tracking information and incorporate that into the experience so that we know very well what you're looking at, because you're always looking at the ball. You don't look off ball, right? Or, you know, rarely would you look off ball. So those are things that I think in the future will make VR more successful.
That's exciting. Steve, from your perspective, what do we really need to do to kind of reach that tipping point? I mean, you talked about some of the technological challenges, right? And like, how important is content? Because right now, there's something like 10 million head-mounted displays out there, 10 million, and then but there's literally billions of phones, right? And you know, and then that whole 2D 360 experience and the magic window some people talk about. How important is that in this mix? From your seat?
So obviously. A 5 gigabit is around the corner, so it's it's 2-3 years away, but it's literally 50 times faster than LTE. It can achieve speeds of 1.2 gigabit to the phone. So that is definitely a tipping point for VR and for VR displays. No doubt about it, because then you have the convenience of your phone and your headset without necessarily being tethered or have to purchase a computer. Which is certainly now the best experience you can possibly have in VR. So I think that's probably the number one issue. And the other issue in sports is to, which a couple companies are focused on, which is to allow you to actually watch a game with a friend, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what you really want in the VR experience to be. I want my brother to be sitting next to me while we're watching the Wizards, right? Because otherwise he just complains about the referees via text. So I'd much rather just be sitting right next to him.
No one complains about the refs. They're fantastic.
Everybody complains about the refs. So although I think our refs are the best in the world.
Yeah.
But I think that's the other experience that needs to be solved for, because obviously sports is a very, very social experience. No matter if you're sitting by yourself, right, texting, posting, whatever, or if you're with friends. Right?
So Steve, with your leadership on the technology side, I mean, it's almost like the finish line is always moving, right? I mean, how do you kind of keep getting motivated each time to say, okay, here's my work isn't done. I've kind of conquered this part of the world. I mean, you did a lot of stuff with large screen formats, et cetera. How does that?
Well, I think our fastest growing audience is on cell phones, right? Is on personal phones, personal devices. So what we're working on now, what I've got immediately in the shop is that I'm taking graphics and parking them in the cloud with HTML that are time code, and then combining them with video so that the fans can define their own experience. What they want in terms of statistics, or notifications, or navigating to other games, or things like that. Because what we're trying to do is take what was the second screen, make it the first screen, and just kind of combine it together. So that's what I got. That's what I got in the shop now.
Wow. So something always interesting in the lab there.
I think we're getting a notification there. We got the bell.
Yeah,
all right. It's a pleasure
all right.
to meet you all.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.